Tu es là? Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue en...
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Commission Press Room. It's a great pleasure to present the President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's snowing in Brussels, and obviously everything grinds to a halt. I have to drive back to the Grand Duchy this evening, and I'm a bit worried about getting across the Ardennes, which are a bit like the Alps at the moment. Well, it's great to be back with you because although I'd like to be here, I'm not here very often. Who's not really a press person, he's a statistician, and he says there are on average 2.5 commissioners a week who talk to you. I do make regular press announcements, but you're not necessarily always there. When Prime Minister or President from a more minor country visits us, then we don't get crowds here, even though there might be some very interesting issues. Whereas when Madame Merkel is visiting, you get 300 journalists, and when heads of state and government come, very few journalists, but at least once, about twice a year, then the journalists seem to suggest that these other countries aren't so important. Now, I encourage our commissioners to mingle and circulate in Europe. It's very important to be in touch with the citizens. And we've had so far 200 meetings of this type with national parliaments, with the social partners, with civil society representatives, and I think that's excellent because we've got to be present on the ground and not just in our Bellemont offices, which aren't necessarily the most pleasant place to be after all. Now, we've come to the end of a difficult year on a number of fronts. At a time when I was feeling particularly weak and vulnerable, then I thought that this was going to be the last chance commission, whereas I think that this is Commission dealing with a multiple and not entirely governed crisis at the moment. Now, we started with the very serious so-called Greek crisis. We managed, together with the Eurogroup, to prevent Greece leaving the Eurozone. Quite a few people felt that the Commission had other fish to fry and that they shouldn't have devoted so much attention to Greece, but we did so because, in my view, Greece is one of the countries of the European Union with many virtues and a great future. Now, last year we also had the refugee crisis. We had to deal with Ukraine. I met the President and Prime Minister of Ukraine at least 6 times last year. And we've met representatives from Russia and President Putin on 3 occasions. We've been grappling with the impact of the reappearance of terrorism in Europe and elsewhere outside Europe, affecting Europeans. And the number of unresolved problems have been piling up, and I'm sure further problems will be added to the list. We've got the issue of the UK. Now, not much is said about it, but people get upset about it, and so I don't have too many illusions about the year ahead, because everything's going to be difficult, but I'm not going to give up. I reject the idea that this is somehow the beginning of the end, and I want to avoid that feeling, but above all to avoid any harmful realities that could reflect that. But I am struck by the number of vulnerabilities in Europe. Now, sometimes we can hold our heads up high. Because we're standing on the shoulders of the giants who preceded us. Kohl, Mitterrand, Delors were brilliant in creating irreversible progress, and we should draw inspiration from them in facing current challenges. I am just one of the representatives of the post-war period, and looking at my biography, the successes and the minor defeats, I think compared to the life of my parents, then the problems I faced have been very small compared to those faced by my parents and grandparents. And so we will continue unfazed to pursue the 10 goals announced to the European Parliament in 2014. And we'll work together and hand in hand with the Parliament. The Parliament has become a faithful ally, because every time they were called on to act, the Parliament has responded fairly promptly. At the beginning of the second full year of the Commission, I'd like to thank the European Parliament very warmly for having unfailingly been present, and I think the President merits a particular thanks, because with and sometimes in challenging me, then he's always managed to rally support in Parliament. We have a pro-European coalition in the Parliament. We have the various pro-European parties, supporters at different levels and in different ways, but we have a grand coalition of ideas and ambitions. The European Parliament is determined and committed, and a great support for us. And this new experience of the electoral campaign in 2014, I think, is something that we need to build on. This was an innovation, a democratic innovation in terms of universal suffrage. And should this fail, as some have predicted, then we can't have a similar campaign in 2019. Now, the idea of the Spitzenkandidat will perhaps be dropped if we were to fail. I'd like this extra momentum, this extra democracy should become a permanent part of the European Union. But I don't think it's time to be smug. When I spoke to the European Parliament at the State of the Union address at the beginning of last year, I said that there isn't enough union in Europe and there isn't enough Europe in the European Union. And I think that remains true. I think the gap between those who consider themselves to be the European elite and the people of Europe remains very wide. And I think that we should be working to bridge the gap between Europe and those who claim to be leading it. And I think the only people who can achieve that are the European Parliament and the European Commission, the truly community institutions. The other institutions in various ways are perhaps less so. Our number one priority will always be growth and jobs. Given the tumultuous year that we've been through, you have got the impression from outside that we've lost sight of this priority, that it slipped into second place. But I still want it to be kept at the forefront, and we should step up ambition in dealing with the challenges faced by European failures in the area of employment. Yes, things are looking up. It looks as if there's a return to growth. But when you're talking in terms of about 2% EU growth, and in the Eurozone, should we be congratulating ourselves? Because the increase in employment and fall in unemployment rates notwithstanding, I think that what we should be seeing is the outcome of budget consolidation, still a priority, structural reforms, which in the medium term will create a basis for economic growth in Europe. And restoring investment to Europe. One of the first acts when I took over as president was to launch the investment plan in November 2014, and all the measures related to it have been put into place thanks to cooperation from the Council and the Parliament in July. Now, you know that this 315 billion program was to remedy a serious lack of investment in Europe. In 2015, we were 14% lower than 2007, the last year prior to the crisis. So there's still a lot that remains to be done. Now, people said that this plan wouldn't work, it wouldn't have the support of the member states' governments, that the markets didn't believe that it was going to work, but after 3 full months of application, then we've managed to mobilise 50 billion of investment. Now, some people have said this is only applying to a handful of member states. In fact, we're present in 22 member states, and thanks to the know-how of the European Investment Bank, we've managed to launch 42 infrastructure projects in 22 member states, as I said, which in the longer term can create 120,000 additional jobs. And we have thousands of SMEs which are benefiting from this, including in a country which seems to feel uneasy about being in Europe. And 80% of the capital is from private sources in areas such as research, energy efficiency, education, innovation, and social infrastructure. Now, I'm not claiming that it's already a success, but it's certainly not the opposite, and it really makes a contribution to the medium-term growth of Europe, and we're going to resolutely pursue this, setting up new projects and maintaining the pace of investment, which we've achieved thanks to all the efforts accompanying this investment plan. I said that at the beginning of the year we were still grappling with the Greek crisis, and then in the second half of the year we had the refugee crisis, but we've been working in a lot of other areas too. Now, a lot has been said about Greece. We've avoided the worst. A lot's been said about the refugee crisis, where we haven't really found any lasting solutions, but there are all sorts of other areas too. Better regulation, for example. And we've had some real successes there. At the beginning of our term of office, then we said that in the future we'd be focusing on doing the big things and adopting a much more timid and modest approach to small things. And we've been true to our word. We took off the legislators, the co-legislators' agenda, some 100 draft projects which we felt weren't really worth the effort. And that's 23 new initiatives launched, mean that an 80% cut in the number of proposals compared to our predecessors. Now, from time to time, even though you don't write a lot about this, you don't raise questions about it in the press room, but I read what you write about it, and apparently some members of the Parliament are frustrated because apparently we're not really providing enough material for the co-legislators to get their teeth into. Now, there are 400 proposals which are going through, and I'd like them to be dealt with as rapidly as possible. Now, in 2015, we announced the European Digital Single Market, a very ambitious approach to build a continent-wide business which will contribute about 250 billion to the clout of European business if the Council accepts all the proposals. And the same holds true for the Energy Union, also a very ambitious programme a continent-wide challenge. We're creating the energy interconnectors between the Baltic countries and Poland, between Estonia and Finland, between France, Portugal, and Spain. And we're basically connecting up the Iberian Peninsula from its previous isolation, and also the capitals market. Everything that was announced in 2014 and approved in October 2014 by the European Parliament, all this has now been implemented, perhaps less visibly. The same holds true of completing the Economic and Monetary Union. We're currently debating the report of the 5 presidents. It's taking place in ECOFIN and the Eurogroup, and in spring 2017 we'll be publishing a white paper on the future of the Economic and Monetary Union. Now, some of the aspects of the 5 presidents' report will be taken on board, but I think in terms of our perspectives and in terms of those from outside who are considering us, we owe it to them to set out the path for the Economic and Monetary Union towards 2020, and we'll do so in our white paper.
The Commission has agreed to complete the Economic and Monetary Union. So, on the Economic and Monetary Union, as I said, completing this is to be accompanied by the Banking Union, which is being pursued. We've had quite a number of successes, but there is an essential element of the Banking Union, and that is a Europe-wide scheme for deposit insurance. Now, I know that in the German-speaking world that's quite a controversial issue, but that's got to be done nevertheless. The prerequisite for this is that there's got to be a certain amount of legislation in place in the member states, which has to be transposed. We cannot have a number of people feeling that they've got to do all the work, while others feel that they cannot pursue the legislative work that they need to do. This is something which requires a lot of additional progress. And when it comes to the risks or the burdens on various financial institutions, we're going to ensure that this is adequately reflected in the arrangements of any deposit insurance scheme. Now, we are also taking our commitments in the area of fiscal policy very seriously. Following our discussions, we have referred a system for computer-based information exchange to the co-legislators. And basically it's a matter of common sense, but we still feel that profits need to be taxed in the country where those profits have been made, rather than allowing large companies and multinationals to escape their obligations to pay taxes. Now, in European political circles, my feeling is that we haven't paid sufficient attention to the Commission's moves. People probably felt that somebody like Juncker was the last person who was going to be able to bring a bit of order into the European fiscal landscape. However, the Commission has focused its attention on fiscal consolidation and re-establishing minimum standards, and that remains an absolute priority for us. Now, Mrs. Vestager, who's an excellent commissioner, has decided to take a look at each country in detail and see what the possible effect of state aid might be with regard to the competitive situation between the various countries. And you will have witnessed a number of initial decisions which have been taken. Social policy is another important element when it comes to describing the overall work of the Commission so far. You will have noted, I think, the social nuances which have been introduced into the European semester system, whereby we have carried out a number of changes. You will have seen that the Commission's initiatives, and those of Mrs. Thyssen in particular, who I fully trust and have full confidence in, these initiatives which she has taken in the area of, say, youth unemployment and long-term unemployment are in place. And you will see that in the course of the year, the Commission will be looking at the whole system, social security, work safety. Back in 1986, I was Labour Minister when these issues were raised during the Delors Commission period and the work to introduce the single market. We had to look at a number of these issues again because a number of these matters do need to be reviewed. We are going to fill out this notion in the course of the year, which takes me right back to the 1980s. We are going to take this idea of a minimum social basis, and this is going to be a demanding text which we hope will at least answer those who claim on the basis of their group's philosophy that we need to review the Secondment of Workers Directive, which is also a difficult task. We're talking about companies who attempt to make use of geographical differences within the European Union, but obviously we cannot allow things to remain as they stand, and the same applies to the mobility package, which Mrs. Thyssen is currently working upon. Then we've got the considerable issue of the flows of refugees into Europe. For several months now, the Commission has been working intensively on producing coherent and consistent European migration policy. To a large extent, we haven't really gone beyond attempting to do so. It's not that the Commission hasn't delivered, but a number of member states, I think, have failed to fully deliver, or indeed to do what needs to be done. And I'm getting a little tired myself of constantly finding that the European Commission and the European Union are criticized for the fact that not enough has allegedly been done. The Commission has done everything that could possibly have been done in very, very difficult circumstances, but a number of member states find it difficult, apparently, to implement decisions which they took themselves in the various councils of ministers. We're moving towards a serious crisis in terms of credibility if in 2016 we don't manage to do what in principle and indeed legally and politically we have resolved to do. It's simply not on that a Commission proposal which is taken on board by Parliament and which is given a lot of support and on the relocation of 160,000 refugees in Europe, it's simply not on that a decision of this type is not subsequently executed. I'm not going to give up, however. The member states of the European Union, in particular those countries who might now feel that they're moving in the right direction by saying we're not taking any refugees. We've got to convince these that this is a decision which has been taken and therefore requires implementation. I meet heads of state and government and others on a regular basis across the globe. And to be quite honest, if you're meeting with the King of Jordan, for example, as I did recently in Paris, and others, and if you've got to try to explain why Europe has not managed to cope with current and future flows of refugees, then it's more than a little embarrassing when your counterpart points out how much more difficult the situation in their country is. If we had to absorb as many refugees in Europe proportionally as, say, Jordan or Lebanon, small, relatively poor countries, that would mean 100 million refugees which would have to be absorbed in Europe. When you think of it like that, we ought to be a little more modest in what we say, rather than attempting to preach to other countries around the world about good governance and how you assist people in need of assistance and so on. Less arrogance and more performance. I think that's got to be our watchword for the future. So we will continue to produce proposals in the course of this year. They will not spontaneously meet the approval of member states, but nevertheless, what needs to be done, and indeed will be done. Schengen is one of the biggest achievements of the European integration process. Without Schengen, without the free movement of workers, without freedom of European citizens to travel, the euro makes no sense. There is a very intimate link between freedom of movement of workers, freedom to travel, and the European currency union. In other words, what is the point of having one currency which you can use across the continent if you cannot travel across the continent as we have been able to do up to now? I don't want to over-dramatize this link, but we've got to remember that it exists nevertheless. And the same applies to the link between Schengen, freedom of movement, and the internal market, which is something we shouldn't overlook either. It's quite an amazing achievement when you consider that these very, very close interlinks between Schengen and the European internal market are not often recognized. That's what makes it so important to complete and indeed maintain the current level of internal market. If anybody wants to kill off Schengen, ultimately what they are going to do is do away with the single market as well. And that's going to lead to unemployment issues in Europe, which will no longer be under our control. That will mean less Schengen means less employment, less economic growth. It's very important to maintain and keep our view on these interlinkages. And I can give you a couple of small examples. For example, border checks at the Öresund bridge, which joins Sweden to Denmark. The costs for these checks have reached 300 million euro already. The backlog, which has arisen because of the checks on this bridge. I mean, every time I do this, you all start clicking away at your cameras. Could I just do it once? You take your photos and then stop so that we can hear what the President is saying. As I said, 300 million euro costs. Backlogs affecting Germany and Denmark as well, 90 million. There are 1.7 million people in Europe who cross borders regularly. Not all that many, I suppose, if you consider that you're talking about 200,000 to and from Luxembourg. But if you consider that there are 47 million cases of road transport every year, and we're talking about potentially up to 1 hour waiting time at borders for border check purposes. That means that that's additional cost of 55,000 euros potentially per truck. Now that's a conservative estimate. But if it continues like this, well, it means that the overall additional costs for border checks in Europe could amount to 3 billion euro. I mean, you've got 24 million business trips per year in the European single market. If all of this were to collapse, well, the economic price, the loss in terms of growth, the damage to European growth prospects, and other would be immeasurable. Now, I've given you figures, I've given you numbers, but when it comes to the logistics for the supply chains and maintaining stocks, I haven't even included those ideas. It means that the European single market would be set to fail. It would certainly be pushed to its limits. I think it's very, very important for those to take who are responsible for taking political decisions to look beyond the actual essence of the refugee crisis, which is important, and take a look at the bigger picture as I have just described it. On the refugee crisis, we're going to have to continue relocation. I'm not going to give way on that. I'm not going to allow the member states to just do what they want. Some are doing a lot, others are not willing to do anything. Some are saying, we're not accepting any refugees at all. That's not on. We've been working on the hotspots and talking about them for several months. These have got to be completed. We have made significant progress on the hotspots, and you will see between now and the next European summit that, especially in Greece, that significant progress will have been made. The whole issue of returns is going to have to be discussed in detail as well. So if people are going to be returned, if they don't have a right to stay here, we will be dependent on the goodwill of third countries. That means that our readmission agreements with third countries will have to be expanded and improved, and we are working on that as well. The same applies to the list of safe third countries. That's something which goes back to a proposal in autumn of last year, but Council hasn't really taken this further. The Council is saying we need a list of safe countries. Then the Council should ultimately adopt such a list rather than complaining again and again and telling us that we should do something which we have done quite some time ago. The Commission has already drawn up proposals on the new European border controls and the Coast Guard Corps, and we are working actively on this. Now that's a project which is not going to resolve all of these issues, but it will at the same time lead to, otherwise, if we cannot consistently patrol the external borders, there are inevitably going to be reintroduced checks on the internal borders within Schengen. The Commission has decided to come up with a proposal on legal migration in the coming months, because Europe is a continent of immigration, and there is a need for additional migration towards Europe in the future. We cannot ignore that fact. So we do need a mechanism for legal migration so that people can come in through the front door rather than prizing open a rear window and trying to get in illegally. So that's something we've got to do in the coming months. Then we've got to agree across Europe on the principle that those who come here and are seeking refuge, or for whatever reasons have come here for a certain period of time, these people must be in a position to regularize their situation and to pursue an occupation. Because if somebody is sitting at home for months or even years, idly, and not working, they're never going to be able to become a fully valued member of European society. And that's important if we want to protect ourselves also from all sorts of unpleasant things. We need a system which allows people to go out and work rather than preventing them from pursuing an occupation. But it's also important to be quite open on the issue of refugees, because we cannot have a situation whereby those who come to Europe then decide rather arrogantly for themselves where they want to live. That's just not possible. That is absolutely not on. It's not the refugees who are responsible for dividing up refugees. It's the member states. No refugee has an innate right to decide where they wish to go, or indeed to refuse to be sent to a particular country. And I can imagine that in the spring we will be suggesting a new version of the Dublin system, which we're going to have to do, really, because the current Dublin system is certainly obviously not working as it should. And once again, it'll be a question of distributing the burden. Everybody is saying that Dublin has got to be reformed, but when that happens, and there you go again with your cameras, yeah. When do we get to that point and make our proposals, we may once again be faced with a lack of will to distribute the Dublin customers, or Dublin clients, if you like, across Europe.
You know, we have to discuss the United Kingdom issue. The negotiations, should I say the talks, are entering a delicate period. The Commission is not a negotiation partner in that context. This is a matter for Member States. Member States are in direct or indirect talks with the British. The Commission, which is working hard on that issue, is a big facilitator. We are issuing ideas. We are trying to inspire processes. We are making suggestions, and we are shipping all this material, all that stuff, to those who are more immediately, in fact, finally in charge. The issues put on the table by the British PM are all difficult issues. Don't think that there is one issue which would be particularly difficult, although it is, and that's the welfare system issue, and that the other points mentioned by the British would be less important, and would be easy to be brought into the decision-making process in a way that immediate solutions and responses would be possible. They are not. Even ever closer union, the role of national parliaments, the relations between the ins and the outs in the framework of the euro system, all these are very, very difficult issues, and we have to work hard in these days to come to common, not only ideas, but to agreements. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I know that we have to deliver. The Commission is doing what the Commission can do. I'm quite sure that we'll have a deal, not a compromise, a solution, not a weak compromise, a permanent solution in February. And then Poland. Pour ce qui est de la Pologne,
as far as Poland is concerned, I must confess the current debate in Europe makes me sad. The Commission doesn't have a problem with Poland. We have a problem with certain initiatives from the new Polish government. Let's not mix up Poland and the new Polish government across the board. I don't want Polish people to have the impression that all of the European Union is rising up against Poland. Poland is a country which inspires a great deal of respect and a great deal of admiration in my case, given the multiple martyrs Poland has suffered repeatedly. And the fate of Poland was often determined by the pernicious acts of those who want to decide in the place of Poland. So the fact that Poland feels a certain pride in its ability to resist is very understandable. And I'd like to say that Poland is an essential actor in the European Union, and in recent years their economic performance has been very impressive.
Phase, a normal phase. I would even say a technical phase. We have some doubts, as others do. We are checking if yes or no these doubts are justified. We are in a dialogue sequence with Poland. My good friend Franz Timmermans has written 3 letters to the Polish authorities. They will have to respond to these letters, and then we'll see what will happen. I do believe that there is room for amendments in different pieces of legislation. That's up to the European Union, that's up to Poland. This say in Poland that this is a matter for the Polish legislator, and that this has no relation whatsoever with European competencies is a totally wrong idea. We are we are acting in the framework of the treaty. The treaty has fixed and described and defined clear principles, and we are checking in the case of Poland, as in other cases, if other cases would occur, if yes or no, a country is still in line with the basic requirements of the treaty. I have the Swiss president now.
Yes, in a while, but first you will have to take a number of questions. Thank you, President. Valentina was the first to ask the floor.